What does the inside of the Earth actually look like? That sounds like the kind of question we answered a long time ago. A crust, a mantle, a liquid outer core, a solid inner core, a neat layered structure, mapped not by sight, but by inference, through pressure, heat, magnetism, and the strange way seismic waves move through rock deep beneath our feet. Scientists don't drill down to look, they listen, they measured, they reconstructed an unseen world from the behavior of energy passing through matter. And by modern standards, that model is remarkably successful. But for most of human history, the Earth's interior was not a settled question. It was a place of myth, a place of punishment, a place of origins, a place of hidden races, buried fires, lost kingdoms, underworld rivers, inner suns, secret entrances, and realms just beneath the familiar crust of ordinary life. Sometimes it was imagined as a realm of the dead, sometimes as a world beneath the world, sometimes as a system of vast caverns, sometimes as a hollow shell, sometimes as an iron furnace, and eventually as the layered geophysical structure taught in classrooms today. What's fascinating is how each age imagines the unseen using the tools it has available. When a civilization thinks in myth, the earth becomes symbolic. When it thinks in theology, the earth becomes moral. When it thinks in empire and exploration, the earth becomes a hidden frontier. When it thinks in science, the earth becomes data, wave paths, densities, temperatures, phase boundaries. Same mystery, different vocabulary. Humanity has always had a talent for filling in the dark with whatever language it trusts most. And maybe that's why this question still has a strange pull. Because no matter how confident we become, we still live on the surface of a sphere whose depths we have never directly seen. We walk over continents, pour concrete, build cities, run cables, lay foundations, all while standing on an outer skin that is shockingly thin compared to the body beneath it. The crust is, in geological terms, almost skin deep. Under oceans, it can be only a few kilometers thick. Beneath continents, it is thicker, but still thin compared to the mantle below. And even within that outer shell, the world is already more hollowed, fractured, and cavernous than most people realize. There are cave systems so large they sound invented. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky is the world's longest known cave system. Son Doong in Vietnam is so vast that parts of it could fit 40-story buildings and even contain their own weather. At Gunung Mulu, cave passages reach dimensions so large UNESCO singles them out on a world scale. At Carlsbad, a single chamber is large enough to feel less like a cave than an underground landscape. And in China, chambers like the Miao Room push the imagination towards something almost planetary in scale. Not a hollow planet, not proof of inner civilizations, just a reminder that the earth beneath us is not so simple. It is ancient, layered, broken, perforated, dynamic, still being discovered. Which brings us to a very unusual statement in the Law of One. Because when this material is asked, in session 60, whether the Earth is solid all the way through from one side to the other, the answer given is not the standard scientific one. And the answer raises a strange possibility. Not necessarily that modern geology is wrong, not necessarily that every old subterranean myth was secretly true, but that throughout history, human beings may have been circling the same mystery from different angles: mythic, speculative, scientific, and metaphysical, each describing, in its own language, what it believed might lie below. So, in this episode, I want to do something simple. I want to take you through the different ways people have imagined the inside of the Earth. Not just quickly, not just a list, but properly. The old underworlds, the subterranean cosmologies, the hollow earth visionaries, the speculative geologists, the modern seismic model. And then finally, after all of that, we'll arrive at what the Law of One actually says. Because sometimes the fastest way to understand a strange claim is to first walk through every other shape the mystery has worn. Long before geology, before seismology, before anyone could measure density, pressure, or wave propagation, there was only one way to understand what lay beneath the earth. You imagined it. And almost universally, what people imagined was not emptiness, not rock, not heat, but a world. In ancient Greece, the earth was not just ground beneath your feet, it was a boundary. Above, the world of the living. Below, a vast, structured realm, the domain of the dead. They called it Hades. And this wasn't some vague afterlife floating in the clouds, it was below, beneath mountains, beneath soil, beneath stone, a place you could, in theory, reach. The journey began at death, but it was described with the geography of a real descent. You didn't vanish, you traveled. First, the soul would arrive at the banks of the river Styx, a dark, slow moving boundary separating the living from the dead. There, you would meet Charon, the ferryman, silent, impartial, eternal. If you had been buried properly, if the rites had been performed, if a coin had been placed beneath your tongue, he would take you across. If not, you waited, sometimes forever. Even in death, logistics matter. Beyond the river, the underworld unfolded not as chaos, but as structure. There were regions. The Elysium, a place of peace reserved for the virtuous. The Tartarus, a deep, punishing abyss for the worst offenders. The Asphodel Meadows, a quiet, neutral expanse for most souls. And presiding over it all, not as a demon, not as a tyrant, but as a ruler maintaining balance, was Hades. What's important here isn't whether any of this is true, it's how specific it is. Rivers, paths, boundaries, regions. This wasn't an abstract idea of afterlife. This was geography. The Greeks imagined the interior of the earth not as uniform rock, but as a layered, cavernous, structured realm with depth, movement, and purpose. Thousands of miles away, in a colder world, another civilization imagined something strikingly similar, but with a different tone. In Norse mythology, the dead did not descend into a fiery abyss. They entered a realm of cold, shadow, and stillness, a place called Helheim. This realm lay beneath the roots of Yggdrasil, the great cosmic tree that connected all realms of existence. And again, this wasn't symbolic in the way we might interpret it today. It was described as a place, a region you could travel to, a domain with gates, boundaries, and guardians. The ruler of this realm was Hel, a figure said to be half alive and half dead, not benevolent, just inevitable. The journey to Hell was long, difficult, and cold. You crossed rivers, you passed through darkness, you descended, always downward. And like the Greeks, the Norse didn't imagine a single uniform destination. There were distinctions. Warriors who died in battle might go elsewhere, to Valhalla, to feast and to fight. But most people, most ordinary lives, ended up beneath the earth, in a quiet, shadowed world that mirrored the one above, but stripped of warmth. These two cultures never met. They developed independently, different climates, different gods, different languages, and yet both imagined a descent beneath the earth, a structured interior, not solid or featureless, a network of regions, not a single space, and a sense that beneath the surface there is more world. Not empty, not uniform, not finished. When humans can't see something, they don't leave it blank. They fill it in with meaning, with story, with structure. And in doing so, they reveal something important. Not necessarily about the Earth itself, but about how we approach the unknown. We don't like uncertainty, so we build worlds beneath our feet. But eventually, story gives way to speculation. Myth gives way to philosophy. Philosophy gives way to early science. And the question begins to shift not what kind of world lies beneath us, but what is the earth actually made of? And that's where the next layer of ideas begins. At some point, the stories started to change. Not all at once, not everywhere, but gradually, across different parts of the world, people began asking a different kind of question. Not what lives beneath the earth, but what is the earth made of? This seems like a small shift, but it changes everything. Because once you stop imagining worlds and start imagining materials, the earth's interior becomes something you can reason about, even if you've never seen it. Early philosophers didn't have drills, they didn't have seismic data, they didn't have instruments. What they had was observation and logic. In ancient Greece, thinkers like Aristotle proposed that everything in the world was made of a combination of four fundamental elements: earth, water, air, and fire. And these weren't just poetic categories, they were considered physical realities, each with natural tendencies. Earth moved downward, fire moved upward, air and water settled in between. So, if you followed that logic, the Earth itself, the planet, must be composed primarily of the heaviest element, Earth, dense, heavy, naturally drawn inward, which led to a simple, powerful conclusion. The deeper you go, the more solid and compressed things become. No vast caverns, no hidden civilizations, no inner worlds, just increasing density. The unknown wasn't filled with stories anymore, it was filled with pressure. But there was a complication: volcanoes. When mountains erupted, when the ground cracked open and poured out fire, it became impossible to ignore something unsettling. There was heat beneath the earth. Not metaphorical heat, not symbolic fire, real, destructive, undeniable molten force. So now the model had to evolve. The earth wasn't just solid, it was layered. Solid material with regions of heat and fire beneath. Some early thinkers imagined underground pockets of flame. Others imagined vast regions of burning material beneath the crust. But still, the overall idea held. The Earth was fundamentally solid, with the disturbances within it. Not hollow, not open, contained. Over time, these ideas became more refined, not through direct observation, but through pattern recognition. Mountains formed, earthquakes shook the ground, volcanic regions clustered in certain areas. There had to be processes beneath the surface. And slowly, very slowly, a new idea began to take shape. The Earth might not be uniform, but it also wasn't empty. It had internal structure, different regions, different behaviors, different properties. Not unlike the myths before it, but stripped of narrative. The underworld didn't disappear, it just lost its characters. And this is where something interesting happens. Even as humanity moved away from myth, the pattern remained. The Greeks imagined regions below: Elysium, Tartarus, Asphodel. Now philosophers imagined dense regions, heated regions, solid interiors. Different language, same instinct. Divide the unseen into layers. Because whether through story or through logic, humans seem to arrive at the same conclusion: that beneath the surface, there isn't just quote unquote more of the same, there is structure. By this point, something important had happened. We had moved away from hidden worlds, moral realms, mythological landscapes, and towards matter, density, heat, and structure. But there was still a problem. Everything we've described so far is based on assumption. No one had been there. No one had seen it. No one had measured it. Which meant there was still room, plenty of room, for imagination to return. And when it didn't come back as myth. It came back as something else. Something that tried to look like science. Something that used logic, but stretched it. Something that felt just plausible enough. A different kind of idea. One that didn't imagine the earth as solid, but as something far more radical. At some point, idea returned, but this time it didn't look like myth. It looked like science. Not modern science, not tested, not verified, but structured, reasoned, and presented with confidence. The idea was simple, and once you hear it, it's hard to unhear. What if the earth is hollow? Not partially hollow, not cavernous in places, but fundamentally empty inside. It didn't begin with fringe thinkers. It began with a respected astronomer, Edmund Halley. In the late 1600s, Halley was trying to solve a problem. The Earth's magnetic field didn't behave the way it should. Compasses drifted, measurements didn't align, variations appeared across different parts of the globe. So Halley proposed something radical, not randomly, not recklessly, but as a working model. What if the Earth wasn't a single solid sphere, but a series of nested shells, one inside another? He imagined an outer shell, inside it another sphere, and another, and possibly even a central core, each one separated by space, each one capable of rotating independently. Why? Because if each inner sphere had its own magnetic properties and rotated slightly differently, it could explain the strange behavior of Earth's magnetism. This wasn't fantasy. This was an attempt to solve a real scientific problem with the tools available at the time. When the data doesn't fit, the imagination steps in to help. And in Halley's model, the Earth wasn't empty chaos. It was structured interior space, layered, ordered, hidden. A century later, the idea changed and became something far more bold. Enter John Cleves Sims Jr. In 1818, Sims made a public declaration: Not a quiet hypothesis, not a tentative proposal, a claim. He wrote, "The earth is hollow and habitable within." But he didn't stop there. He described the mechanism. The earth, he said, was not only hollow, it was open at the poles. Massive openings, thousands of miles across. These openings allowed entry into the interior world, a world he believed could be explored, mapped, even inhabited. And Sims wasn't joking. He spent years trying to organize an expedition to prove it. He gave lectures, published papers, sought funding. He believed completely. And what's fascinating is that people listened. Because in the early 1800s, the poles were still unknown, unexplored, unseen. Maps faded into uncertainty near the Arctic and Antarctic. There was still space, literally, for ideas like this to exist. Sims's vision wasn't just empty space inside the Earth, it was a world with light, with atmosphere, possibly with life. A return, in a strange way, to the ancient idea, but dressed in the language of exploration. Not an underworld of the dead, but a frontier waiting to be discovered. The idea didn't stay contained, it spread. Writers picked it up, explorers speculated, audiences imagined. In 1864, Jules Verne published Journey to the Center of the Earth. In it, a group descends through volcanic passages into the vast underground world, not empty, not solid, but filled with oceans, caverns, prehistoric life, entire ecosystems. And while Verne's work was fiction, it didn't feel impossible to readers at the time. Because the idea of Earth's interior was still unresolved, it was still open. From our perspective today, this might sound absurd, but at that time, the deep Earth was completely inaccessible. The poles were unexplored, geology was still developing, and magnetism was poorly understood. There were gaps. And where there are gaps, ideas grow. The hollow earth theory wasn't just imagination, it was an attempt to fill the unknown with something structured, something meaningful, something discoverable. And perhaps more importantly, it satisfied a very human instinct, the idea that beneath us there's more world, not just rock, not just heat, but space. And if you step back, you start to see something familiar. The Greeks imagined structured realms below. The Norse imagined layered domains beneath roots. Early philosophers imagined structured material. Now, the hollow earth theorists imagine structured space. Different forms, same impulse. To refuse the idea that the unknown is empty. To insist that beneath the surface is something waiting. But eventually, this idea met something it couldn't overcome: evidence. Because as the 19th century moved forward, science began to change. Not in philosophy, but in method. Observation became measurement. Measurement became repeatable. And repeatability became truth testing. And slowly, the hollow earth began to collapse. Not all at once, but piece by piece, until a new model emerged. One that didn't rely on imagination or speculation or storytelling, but on something far more subtle: waves. By the late 1800s, something changed. The question of what lay beneath the earth was no longer answered with stories, or speculation, or even philosophy. It was answered with signals. Not from drills, not from direct observation, but from something far more indirect: earthquakes. When the earth shakes, it doesn't just move, it rings. Energy travels outward from the source of an earthquake in all directions: through rock, through liquid, through whatever lies beneath the surface. These waves move through the earth the way sound moves through air, or vibrations move through a string. And crucially, they don't all behave the same. Scientists identified two primary types of seismic waves: P waves, primary waves, that are fast, compressional, and can move through solids, liquids, and gases, and S waves, secondary waves. They are slower, shearing motion, and can move through solids only. That last detail changed everything. Because if you track how these waves travel through Earth, you begin to notice something strange. After a large earthquake, seismic stations around the world record incoming waves. But there are regions where certain waves never arrive. S waves, in particular, simply disappear beyond a certain distance. They don't weaken, they don't distort, they disappear. Which leads to a simple conclusion: at some depth, there must be a region that cannot support shear waves. In other words, a liquid layer. This discovery led to one of the most important breakthroughs in Earth science. Beneath the mantle, there exists a vast region of molten material. We call it the outer core. It is not hollow, not empty, but not solid either. A churning metallic ocean, primarily iron and nickel, moving under immense pressure and heat. And it's not just sitting there, it's moving. That motion generates Earth's magnetic field. The same mystery that led Halley to imagine nested spheres was eventually explained by the sea of liquid metal. But the story doesn't stop there. P waves, remember, can travel through both solid and liquid. And when scientists tracked how these P waves move through the Earth, they noticed something else. At the very center, the waves sped up again, which suggests that beyond the liquid outer core, there is another layer, one that is solid. This is the inner core, a dense sphere under such extreme pressure that, despite temperatures comparable to the surface of the sun, it remains solid. So the modern model of the Earth looks like this: crust, thin, brittle outer layer; mantle, thick, slow moving rock behaving like a viscous fluid; outer core, liquid metal; inner core, solid metal. No vast open spaces, no internal skies, no hidden continents, just layers, defined not by imagination, but by how energy moves through them. And this is the key. We still haven't seen the Earth's interior, not directly. The deepest humans ever drilled barely scratches the crust. Everything we know about the deep Earth comes from interpretation, from listening to how waves behave and reconstructing a model that explains those behaviors. It's incredibly precise, incredibly consistent, but still indirect. We replace myth with measurement, but not with sight. And if you step back again, the pattern hasn't disappeared. We still observe something we can't fully access, build a model to explain it, and refine that model over time. The language has changed, the tools have improved, the accuracy has increased, but the process is still the same. We are still describing the unseen. And today, this layered model is the best explanation we have. It predicts behavior, it matches data, it holds under scrutiny, which is why it's taught as fact. But even here, there's a quiet humility beneath the surface, because everything we know about the deep earth is still based on how something else moves through it, not from being there. So now, we've seen the progression: mythic worlds beneath the earth, philosophical ideas of dense material, radical hollow earth theories, and finally, a precise scientific model built on seismic evidence. Each one more refined than the last, each one closer, presumably, to the truth. And that brings us to a strange moment. Because after all of this, after centuries of evolving ideas, after myth, speculation, and science, there is still another description. One that doesn't quite match the others. One that doesn't come from measurement or exploration or mythology, but from something else entirely. And it's here, after everything we've just walked through, that it finally makes sense to ask, what does the law of one say? So, we've walked through it: the underworlds of myth, the early attempts to reason about matter, the radical hollow earth proposals, the modern scientific model built on waves, data, and inference. Each one an attempt to describe something no one has ever directly seen. And now, after all of that, we arrive at a very different kind of description. Not one built from exploration, not one built from measurement, but one that comes from the law of one. And it begins simply: you may say that your sphere is of a honeycomb nature. That's it. No diagrams, no measurements, no equations, just a statement. And yet, if you let it sit for a moment, it doesn't quite behave like any of the ideas we've already explored. It's not the mythic underworlds, there's no mention of realms or rivers or judgment. It's not the hollow earth, there's no vast open interior, no inner sky, no hidden continents. And it's not quite the modern scientific model either, which describes a continuous structure of layered material. Instead, it suggests something else: not empty, not uniform, but perforated, structured with space within structure, like a network, a system of internal cavities woven through the body of the planet. Not a world beneath the world, but a world with space inside it. And here's where something interesting happens. Because while this idea might sound unusual, the Earth, even as we currently understand it, is already far less solid than most people imagine. There are those vast cave systems beneath the Earth. Not theoretical ones, but real, documented, mapped environments. In Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, hundreds of miles of passages stretch beneath the ground, the longest known cave system on Earth. In Sun Dong Cave in Vietnam, entire sections are so large they can contain skyscrapers. Clouds form inside, weather systems move through its chambers. In the Mulu Caves in Malaysia, vast passageways carved through limestone mountains, spaces so immense they challenge the idea of what a cave even is. At Carlsbad Caverns, a single chamber opens into something closer to an underground landscape than a room. And in China's Miao Room, the scale becomes almost difficult to comprehend. These are not small voids, they are enormous, and they exist within what we casually think of as solid Earth. Now, to be clear, these cave systems exist within the crust. They don't extend deep into the mantle or anywhere near the core. They don't prove anything about the deeper structure of the planet, but they do something else. They soften the assumption that quote unquote solid means completely filled, completely uniform, completely without space. Because even in the thin outer layer we inhabit, the Earth is already riddled with absence, voids, channels, chambers, a kind of natural architecture. So when the Law of One describes a Earth as honeycomb, it doesn't immediately translate into any one existing model. It doesn't confirm hollow Earth theories. It doesn't align neatly with standard geology. It introduces something adjacent, a structural idea. Not emptiness, not uniform density, but patterned interior space. And notably, when asked whether the Earth is solid all the way through, the response continues. The center is, however, solid if you would so call that which is molten, which is an interesting phrasing because it doesn't reject the idea of a molten interior, but it frames it a little differently, not as a simple layered boundary, but as part of a more complex structure. And this is where things become a little unclear, because unlike the scientific model, this description doesn't come with predictive equations, measurable parameters, testable methods. It doesn't tell us how to verify it or how to falsify it. It simply presents a different way of describing what lies beneath. And so it sits, not in competition with science, not in alignment with myth, but somewhere else entirely, another lens. One that doesn't replace the others, but exists alongside them. And maybe that's the most interesting part, that across history, we've imagined the Earth's interior as a realm of the dead, a structured moral landscape, a solid mass of compressed material, a hollow world, a layered system inferred through waves, and now a structured of internal pattern and space. Different ideas, different methods, different levels of confidence, but all orbiting the same question: what lies beneath? And just when that question feels like it might settle, the law of one adds something else. Not an explanation, not a clarification, just additional details. Small pieces of information that don't necessarily fit into the model itself, but make it stranger. And then, just as the description seems to settle, a honeycomb like structure, a molten center, the law of one adds something else. Not an explanation, not a continuation of the model, just additional details. Details that don't necessarily help us understand the structure itself, but make it a little bit stranger. In session 60.22, a question is asked directly: are there third density incarnate entities living in the honeycomb areas? And the response is simple: this was at one time correct. This is not correct at this present space time. At one time, there were beings similar to us living there. Now there are not. No elaboration, no timeline, no explanation of who they were or when they existed. Just a quiet statement that at some point in Earth's past, the interior, whatever its structure may be, was not empty, occupied, and no longer occupied. Then in session 60.23, the question shifts slightly. Are there still entities in these regions? Not necessarily physical ones, but something else? And the answer becomes more complex. There are some which do as you say. Further, there are some inner plane entities of this planet which prefer to do some materialization into third density visible in these areas. So now we're not talking about civilizations in the traditional sense. We're talking about inner plane entities, beings not normally visible, entities that can, at times, become visible. And notably, they choose these areas, the interior spaces, the hidden regions, the places beneath the surface, not as permanent homes, but as points of transition, places where the unseen briefly touches the seen. And then, almost casually, another detail is added. There are also bases, shall we say, in these areas of those from elsewhere, both positive and negative. There are abandoned cities. No buildup, no emphasis, just stated. Bases, not natural formations, not geological structures, something constructed, used by those from elsewhere, and not aligned in one direction, both positive and negative. And alongside that, abandoned cities, which raises questions that the material does not answer. Who built them? Why were they abandoned? No context, no elaboration, just a fragment. Like finding a single line in a book that hints at an entire story that was never written. And finally, in session 60.24, the question becomes practical. What are these bases used for? And the answer is unexpectedly specific. These bases are used for the work of materialization of needed equipment for communication with third density entities and for resting places for some equipment which you might call small craft. These are used for surveillance when it is requested by entities. Thus, some of the, shall we say, teachers of the Confederation speak partially through these surveillance instruments along computerized lines, and when information is desired and those requesting it are of proper vibratory level, the Confederation entity itself will then speak. They're used for materialization of equipment, communication with third density entities, storage and resting places for craft, and something else surveillance, but not in the way we might immediately imagine. They are used for surveillance when it is requested by entities. Requested, not imposed, which introduces a different dynamic entirely. And then one final subtle detail. Some communication may occur partially through these systems, and when conditions are right, when the vibratory level is aligned, direct communication becomes possible. And that's where it ends. No conclusion, no synthesis, no attempt to tie it all together, just a set of details attached to the earlier description, which leaves us in a familiar place. Because throughout this entire episode, we've seen different ways of describing the unseen. Myth gave us worlds beneath the earth. Philosophy gave us substance and density. Hollow Earth gave us internal space. Science gave us layered structure. The Law of One gives us something else, a structure with space within it and details that extend beyond geology. And whether any of this is literal, symbolic, misinterpreted, or something else entirely isn't really the point. Because what's consistent across every version is not the answer, it's the attempt to understand what lies beneath us without ever being able to fully see it. And maybe that's the more interesting truth. Not what the Earth is made of, but how we as a species respond to what we cannot directly perceive. We don't leave it empty, we fill it with story, with theory, with measurement, with meaning, and occasionally with something that doesn't quite fit anywhere else. Thank you for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.